webinar, more detail mastery, on our level being webinar, 9 mastery, more detail on level being 9 mastery program. Wow! Mastery program. Level being 9 mastery.
Okay, well, welcome to You Learn Naturally Radio. It's my pleasure to introduce two very, very wonderful beekeepers and to explore an introduction to beekeeping. This is done to kick off the start of our Science Week program, Science Week 2021, and our Science Week theme is the science of beekeeping. So I'm very pleased to be with Beekeeper Katy Langley and also Beekeeper Abenah. And over the course of our conversation, we're going to get to know each other and get to know the bees and the business of beekeeping. Beekeeper Katy Langley, please introduce yourself. I'm very pleased to hear from you, and let's begin.
Well, thank you very much indeed for inviting me to participate in British Science Week. And I do have a science background, but I've only been beekeeping. We're just entering my 6th season now, but it's something that I've developed sort of quite a passion for, and I find all insects extremely interesting, but bees in particular. So the purpose of this discussion is really just an overview of bees and beekeeping and the various aspects of the bees' existence and how human beings interact with them. So the first slide I've got is really about arthropods. It's what bees are, where they come from on the sort of evolutionary tree. So the sort of bottom of the evolutionary pile on this slide is annelids, worms, and then it sort of moves up to more complex organisms like millipedes and centipedes, the now extinct trilobites, and then through crabs, and then the other branch of the arthropods.
Before you go to the other branch, let me take us forward into the beginning. And before we get to this detail, I think it would be useful. One, we should have a bit more detail about how you've come to be a beekeeper, but also I just want to introduce Beekeeper Abenah and get that balance of where she's coming from as well.
That's a good idea.
Abenah.
Sorry.
Hi there. Hi, greetings, and thank you for inviting me onto this audio interview. It's very exciting with the beekeeping. I've been beekeeping for just over a little 2 years. So this is my second winter season. And I wanted to be a beekeeper. I actually wanted to indulge in it, and my background is that I just love honey. And that's what led me on to beekeeping after looking at a website and seeing that there was almost like a tester kind of beekeeping day that I attended, and it so happened that there was a course happening in my area from the following day. So I embarked on it, and here I am in my second season.
Well done to both of you. I am the youngest of the beekeepers, have not yet had a first season, and I should explain that this is, as well as being a Science Week program focused on beekeeping, this will be the beginning of our organization's practice of beekeeping. Let me explain a bit more, just for those who are completely new to You Learn Naturally Radio. This You Learn Naturally Radio service is part of Abundant Centres UK Development Trust. We're a learner cooperative, and we're focused on steamed up learning. That's basically STEM plus the arts, which is science, technology, engineering, and math plus the arts. We value very much the way that cultural arts supports is integral to the learning of what's called science and what's called mathematics and other areas. So it's unified knowledge, and this is our organization is based on this, built on this. We have a program called Level Being 9, which is a special cadet program helping younger people, younger children, do advanced work as part of a Black Open University program, Black Open University project. And all of this, the business of exploring the science of beekeeping, will produce various kinds of learning experience where younger children can do advanced work, particularly around the GCSE. Our intention is to integrate the science that we're going to discuss over the program with the GCSE curricula for science and for mathematics in particular. But yes, Beekeeper Katy, you were keen to jump in, and I really am very pleased. We've got a lot to go through. We are blending our conversation. Obviously, listeners may be enjoying this in two different ways. Some will be hearing it as audio on our You Learn Naturally radio, but some will be seeing it as the visual podcast. So there's a full slideshow, a full program of visuals, which we are going to talk through. You've done a lot of, you've made a really comprehensive presentation. So before we jump into that, please tell us a bit about how you've come to be a beekeeper.
That's me. I don't want to steal Abenah's thunder again.
No, it's you. We are the novice in this.
I've got all these slides, and I was thinking, oh God, I better get a move on. So I do apologise. So, I got into beekeeping completely by accident. A friend of mine on our allotment, who I really at the time didn't know very well at all, managed to catch 4 swarms of bees. This is obviously a local beekeeper, hadn't been managing their bees very well, and the bees were swarming on the allotment. And someone had tried to keep bees many years previously, and the bees had died out, and there are a couple of abandoned hives. So the first couple of swarms, she just literally took the lid off the hive and threw the bees in, having caught them in a cardboard box, just picked them off the tree. And then more swarms arrived, and she found some other boxes and bits to put them in, but they didn't have proper hives. And after she got them through winter, she decided she wanted to go on a beekeeping course, and she has dyslexia, so she picked out me from a distance on the basis that she thought I looked sensible and wasn't scared of insects, and asked me if I'd come on the course and take notes, which I agreed to do, even though I was very busy. And within the first 10 minutes, I knew that having 4 colonies of bees was going to be a very big project, and she would need some help, because bees you have to keep records on them. They're considered to be livestock. They have notifiable diseases. They're subject to inspections by bee inspectors.
Bee inspectors? Bee inspectors, yeah. Wow.
Bee inspectors,
wow.
Yeah. So you've got your local seasonal bee inspector, and they will inspect your colonies for notifiable diseases. And unfortunately, if they have something called American foul brood, the solution for that is regrettably to set fire to the hive, because it's so contagious. And this is not a new disease. It's been around for many years, actually. It was first noted in Germany in about 1760, and it does literally make the hive smell awful. It's a bacterial infection, and the smell is actually the smell of the decomposing larvae. It's sort of secondary opportunistic bacteria that come in and generate this unpleasant smell. So it's not a new disease, but it is, however, very serious, and it can sort of rip through colonies of bees and just destroy them. And it also is something that can affect other flying insects, wasps and bumblebees, etc. So it's very serious. So that's why we have bee inspectors.
Well, I'm very glad that you have a good knowledge of these things, and your science background makes you very sensitive to the detail. And we appreciate that, because that's part of the science. I think I should say that I expect that many of our audience on You Learn Naturally Radio I have not considered the idea that they will be ever keeping insects. So they may be very, very far away from the idea that we're talking about. And I would like to welcome everyone into it. Although I haven't kept bees, I have kept insects. I've kept the Philocrania paradoxa. I've kept the African deadleaf mantis. And so I have some experience with this and other creatures that it needs as food. So I'm familiar like this, and it's a world. It's a great learning. It's something that I can see our cadets will benefit greatly from. So I'm keen to give everyone the real joy inside of it, as well as the challenges. Obviously, we have to be mindful for the things that are important considerations. You were introducing us to the species structure. I think so.
Yes.
Let's do
right.
that again.
It was just the first slide. It really just describes where sort of bees fall within the sort of evolutionary tree of arthropods, and arthropods means that they have jointed feet. So the arthropods sort of started off with a proto-worm, and then branched off through various other sort of many-legged insects like centipedes and spiders and horseshoe crabs. And the other branch of arthropods are things like shrimps and sort of ordinary crabs and insects. And this is where bees sort of come into the evolutionary scale. Now, they had a common ancestor about 130 million years ago, which then diverted off into a variety of different species of bee. And the honeybee that we know really only split off about 20 million years ago. I do have a slide of the earliest bee recognizable sort of bee fossil. I mean, obviously, insects are very small and you're very unlikely to find them fossilized, but luckily this one was trapped in amber, which is the exudate resin of a pine tree, and it's about between 35 and 46 million years old. And as you can imagine, it is pretty bashed about, but you can just about see that it's got antennae, it's got legs, it's got recognizable wings, and it does resemble a bee. So my next slide is really answering the question, why do bees make honey? Unlike bumblebees or some of the many other solitary bees that are found in the UK, honeybees survive through the winter. And bumblebees survive through the winter as a hibernating mated queen, but all the worker bees die. Honeybees, though, all stay through the winter. They collect the honey and the nectar to feed themselves through that winter, and then they've got a head start in the spring when the daylight lengthens and the weather warms up, and then they're able to start the colony off again, and spring is the sort of prime time for swarming. So that's why bees make honey, to get themselves through winter. And obviously over many, many years we've sort of selected bees.
Sorry, just to say, I mean, when you say to get themselves through winter, it's their food, right?
It's their food, absolutely. That's why bees make honey. It's not for us. I was just going to say we've selectively bred them so they make lots of honey, so we can have a share of it. And depending on how you like to keep your bees, some people take all the honey off their bees and then feed their bees syrup through winter. I personally leave them enough honey that I judge they should be able to easily survive on the amount of honey that I've left them, and any excess I take and process and indeed sell in markets, etc. But not everyone does that. Certainly.
Yes. Katy, if you said that some people use syrup, would that be made of with sugar?
Yes. I mean, you can buy commercial, what they call invert syrups, where the sucrose has been inverted by a process that prevents its fermenting, and it prevents it sort of getting mouldy. And so this is sort of considered to be a good thing to put on the hive because it won't go mouldy or ferment and in any way upset the bees' digestion. I mean, the problem we have at the moment with climate change is, of course, the winters are very much warmer. So what happens if it's above sort of like 10 degrees, the bees will fly out imagining they're going to find flowers to forage from, and of course very little is in flower. So they're going to exhaust their supplies of honey. So throughout winter, I do check the colonies. I just literally lift them. It's called hefting. I lift them to see how heavy they are. And then, if necessary, I will feed them with syrup or fondant, which is a mixture of sucrose, glucose, and water. But generally, I hope I have always left them enough honey to get by on without them having to eat any sort of human-generated food substitute. But I'd rather give them the syrup and then they don't use it than not give them the syrup and then discover that they are, they're starving. So sometimes I'll think, oh, they're probably okay, but I'll give them a bit of extra food. And if they, in my experience, if they don't need it, they don't use it.
Yeah.
What do you do?
Well, my first year, because it was the first year, I actually used sugar water. But I kind of had reservations on it at the time, but I didn't have anything else to use. So everybody that was trained used sugar water, or a mixture of sugar water. Mm-hmm. And in my head, sugar is really not good for you. So why would we be giving it to the bees? I heard a thing where the bees know, or they do something that actually changes the structure or something. But for me, at the end of the day, sugar is sugar. So I didn't feel too great about doing that. So this time round, I actually left honey on the hive for them. I'm just hoping that they have got through the winter, because I did lose a queen, but we can talk about that later.
I think with the syrup, even though sugar is not particularly great for human beings, it is quite a pure substance. So it's insofar as it contains relatively few impurities and it is quite a simple structure. So it's actually reasonably close to nectar, which is a mixture of glucose and fructose. So I think from that aspect, it's probably reasonably close to nectar, and the bees will invert it themselves as well. That's they use an enzyme called invertase, which also stops it sort of going off. But anyhow, my next slide is to survive the winter, and it's a picture of what the bees do when the weather is very cold, and they literally cluster together. And they vibrate their wing muscles to keep the whole colony warm. And when the weather's cold, they just stay all snuggled up together, keeping each other warm, and they will sort of circulate. The ones that are vibrating their wing muscles, they'll have a rest, and other ones will take over so they don't all end up exhausted. But of course, this also does take a certain amount of energy, so they'll need to consume honey to continue with this process. But then if the weather's warm, this is when they'll go flying out to see if they can find any nectar, and they unfortunately are going to be disappointed in the winter.
So during the winter, some of the bees do die off, don't they?
They do. Well, you get... this is very interesting, because the summer bees only live about 6 weeks, because they literally exhaust themselves by flying out and foraging. They do work incredibly hard, so the sort of phrase to be as busy as a bee is not to be taken lightly. Now, in the winter, because the bees are far less active, there is some controversy over whether the winter bees are genetically different to the summer bees, in that they are very much more long-lived, because they live to be about 6 months old. Because they survive through the winter, or whether they survive because they're not exhausting themselves in the way that the hard-working summer bees do. But as I say, that is, there are various camps as to whether this is the case or not.
Okay.
shall I go on to my next slide is a completely sort of different topic. So shall I continue on with that, Dr. Murray?
Well, you should, but before you do, this is a good time for us to go to a little break. And just let's do that.
Level being 9, more detail mastery. On our level being level 9, mastery more detail on level being 9, mastery program. Wow! Mastery program. Level being 9, mastery.
Welcome forward into the next segment. And that was a very, very good introduction that you've given. I think now we're going a bit into the anciency of the humble bee. Tell us some more, please.
Well, one of the things that interests me about bees and beekeeping is that humanity has had a relationship with bees for a very, very long time. And one of the ways that we know this is from cave paintings. So one of my favourite cave paintings is in a Rana cave in Spain, and it's between 8,000 and 15,000 years old. And it looks as though from this that somebody is climbing up a very long ladder, and they have a basket, and they are approaching a hive of bees, and the painter has actually drawn the bees, and as the bees are all different sizes, so you can really imagine that the bees are flying towards you out of the painting. So I get the feeling that whoever created this painting had a quite close experience. The other thing that interests me about this is that at the bottom of the ladder there is a stick person holding the ladder, but the person who's climbing the ladder and getting the honey has got quite a big bum, quite like me, and I'm pretty sure that is a woman who's up the top of the ladder collecting the honey, and there are some other experts in cave painting who will agree with me. The next slide is
I was just going to say, on that particular picture, it could be that they just have some kind of equipment on or some protection on.
I don't know that we can really say for sure, because what you can't see is that it's with the other half of the picture, the person holding the ladder hasn't been drawn with any clothes on at all. So
they're safe.
So maybe that's the best, because then the bees perhaps don't get caught in your clothing. Then the next slide is taken from a cave painting in India, and this one is about 8,000 years old. And there again, this is Apis mellifera dorsata, which is a slightly different variety of bees to Apis mellifera, who's the one we commonly keep in the UK. And they produce a large sort of semicircle of honeycomb that hangs from a cliff. And they've got two ladders, and there again, it's been reasonably well established that the person collecting the honey is a woman. There are several hundred cave paintings in the world depicting honey collection or bees, etc. And there are a few women present. It just so happens that the two clearest and most interesting images that I was able to find for this presentation happen to have women in them. But there are a lot of men collecting honey in other cave paintings, so don't feel left out, guys. My next slide is actually collecting honey from a cliff in Nepal, and this is a modern.
So before you go on, as you've touched the gender subjects, do you feel that there is any particular qualities to beekeeping that sit well with particular genders? Do you feel that?
I don't. I don't. I think you have to have a reasonable amount of physical strength. But then, I've had to help out friends of mine who've hurt their backs, and so I've had to do all the heavy lifting, and they've just sort of stood there and supervised, sort of thing. And it's been guys who've hurt their backs. So it's just one of those things. So if you don't have the necessarily the physical strength necessary, you just work in a team. It doesn't preclude you from doing anything. Or, I also know of a beekeeper who's in a wheelchair, and they just have their hive set up differently. and they make sure that they've got that they can reach everything they need to reach, and they've got the physical strength, because obviously sitting down you don't have quite the reach that you do standing, and they just organise themselves around it. So I don't actually think there's any sort of gendered issue. I just think it's interesting that it seems to be quite that there are women present doing this work 8,000 years ago.
Yeah.
Okay.
Wow.
Okay. The reason I ask is because we've got quite a number of speakers, not many women speakers, but you are part of that balance, which is great. We've got Professor Jean Kritsky. He will be speaking on ancient Egypt and beekeeping. But in my pre-conversation with him, and he's also spoken about how he views the practice, he's a practicing beekeeper, as a very, bringing out a great sensitivity in the practitioner. His experience is that the practice brings out a sensitivity in the practitioner and a certain higher level of harmony. Some things, in some cultures they might consider those feminine qualities. That's why I was just touching on it to see, as you mentioned, the gender
that's
point.
very interesting. I mean, the thing is that more than half of our membership is women in the beekeeping association that I'm in. And some of the people who keep large numbers of bees are also women. So I think it's quite evenly sort of spread. But you may find that some women are shyer about giving presentations, etc., than some of the guys are. I don't know.
Okay, well,
Shyness
definitely.
is not something that I've suffered from particularly. You may have noticed.
Well, we're very glad for that, and we want to encourage that boldness in all our listeners, boys and girls, men and women. Okay, thank you. Continue, please.
Right. So my next slide is a photograph taken recently in Nepal, where there is a guy up a ladder collecting honey from Apis mellifera, and so you can actually see the great crescents of honeycomb that were depicted in the previous cave painting, and you can also see that from the rope ladder and the knives he's got on the ends of sticks and things like that, that the equipment that he is using is virtually identical to that used 8,000 years ago.
Yeah.
He's also, you can probably see there's a bit of smoke in the photo, so he's probably using smoke to pacify the bees as well. So my next slide is a piece of sort of grave goods. So this was buried with the owner, and it's a knife blade that's been attached to the handle with honey and beeswax. And this is from around 3,300 before Christian era. And so it shows that honey and beeswax have been used as adhesives in the sort of manufacture of knives and axes and other items. My next slide is a hieroglyph of a bee, and bees were very important in Egypt. And they are certainly, Egypt is considered to be one of the first places where we have records of actual beekeeping. So beekeeping was a job. Going back on to the bee inspectors, they had overseers of beekeepers. Honey was considered to be a very valuable commodity because it was really the only natural source of sweetness that people had access to. My next image is of an Egyptian.
Katy, just going back to Egyptian and beekeeping, is there records of royal jelly being used? Because that is a rich substance.
I haven't encountered royal jelly. The only aspects I've encountered have been honey. I think royal jelly, you need to have you need to be able to scoop it out of each cell individually. And I think the main thing that they were possibly interested in was the honey. But I haven't, I mean, I've read a book on beekeeping in ancient Egypt, but I certainly haven't delved completely into what other products they had. I mean, because they had a written record, they would, of course, recorded the amount of honey collected, who it was given to, and they also, there was this wonderful letter that I read in Professor Jean Christie's book about how they had moved some beehives to forage on the nectar, and someone was supposed to send them some donkeys to collect the hives, and they hadn't sent the donkeys yet. So they sent this person a letter saying, we really must have these donkeys, otherwise, the hives are going to suffer because they want to clear that land sowing crops, and they're going to set fire to it. So the bees are going to be destroyed unless you bring your donkeys. So it's an amazing insight into life thousands and thousands of years ago. So the image that I've got now on Egyptian beekeeping is of a sort of a block of 8 bees all facing off to the right. And to the left of the picture, there is a man kneeling with sort of his hands held up and a bee near him. But in between, there are these rather strange sort of almost coffin-shaped objects. And those are, in fact, Egyptian beehives. They were made in clay pipes, and they would probably have been about half a metre long and maybe 30 or 40 centimetres wide. So they're almost like drain pipes. And the bees they'd have made their honeycomb, so they'd have come out in circular sections of honeycomb.
This area, before you move on, because you've touched it, it's important that you do, because the ancient Kemetic culture, the ancient Egyptian culture, is a very well preserved classic heritage on beekeeping. In fact, it is the best by what I can gather from his work, Professor Kritzsky. So we will be going into detail on this. We're going to be exploring how those, like you've touched on some of the hieroglyphs, but we have a sense that there is a deeper or several layers to the hieroglyphic language, the Medu Netta language. So we'll be exploring that work with Professor as well, in terms of that. And also the business of the food and the products of bees. I think his work has also gone into how different products of bees have been used in ancient culture. So there's Abenah, I think there's some things to be found in that series of presentations that we'll be coming to as well.
Okay. I'm very excited to hear about that.
It's going to be great. Yeah. Okay, let's go.
Okay, so the next slide I've got is from a painting by Bruegel, and it is from 1568, and it's these rather comical characters who have woven baskets on their heads, and this is because they're beekeepers, so they've woven the beekeeping skeps or hives, and they have woven baskets to stop the bees stinging them. And they've got quite, they look pretty well wrapped up as well. They've got long sleeves, long sort of leggings on, etc. So they're obviously being, they're trying to avoid being stung by the bees. The next slide I've got is a modern photograph, but it's showing mud skeps from Poland, and these have been made since medieval times. And they're really like an upside-down bell, and some of them are painted very nicely as well. And there's a little hole at the sort of wider part of the bell, and this is where the bees can fly in and out. The next slide I've got shows just an absolute multiplicity of different types of hive. There's a top bar hive, there's a log hive, there's a standard sort of pretty beehive that you usually see on jars of honey. You can have an exciting hive on the wall of your living room with a pipe going out through your window, so the bees can all fly in and out through that pipe and live on your wall. You've got a woven skep, and you can still go on courses to weave skeps when you can, when there's not a pandemic on. There's hives made of high-density polystyrene. There's an all-plastic hive. And also there's something called the flow hive, where very clever father and son in Australia have developed a hive where you literally put a key into the top of the hive and turn it round, and in the heat of Australia, the honey flows out into a jar, straight, right next to the hive. And also
Lovely.
just the actual sort of hives you get in a tree. And, bees have evolved mostly to live safely in a cavity. So they'll have a hollow tree trunk or something like that, unless, of course, there's different varieties, which we've already mentioned in the cave paintings, where they will hang from the top of a cliff or something, so that they're sort of pretty much out of the way of predators.
This selection is very interesting to see the diversity of beehives, and it's a good point for me to make here is that our project will be looking to those natural structures. There are different structures, and it's interesting to me because we've approached various beekeeping practitioners, and as you know, Beekeeper, Katy, you know that there's people who espouse sort of natural beekeeping or different ways to approach it. But essentially, from you start to keep bees, then you've removed away from them just being in their natural setup. But that said, as you mentioned at the very beginning, it's farming. This is a farming practice, and that's an important learning. It's important for young people to learn about farming. So it's interesting that they can learn about farming through beekeeping. The business of making the hive with the weaving, this is something we're very keen to adopt this practice, especially in regard to the engineering of that. That's an engineering task. And so it's a craft, but it's engineering as well. And yeah, this is something I just thought I'd mention. We'll be adopting those kind of practices. You mentioned the flow hive. That caught my eye because I think over the course of our project, we will explore various types of hives just so that we can experience the difference between them. The project is about, I know people will, obviously it's honey. People love the idea of getting honey from it. But really, it's focused on the education and the study of the bees, the study of the insights that can come from that. But that flow hive, I watched a documentary on this with some cautions on it. They were saying that you have to be careful with the flow hive. This is the one at the bottom left of the image that you've presented, types of beehives, the bottom left. And they were saying that if you're not careful, when you turn the key to turn the inner structure at an angle so the honey flows out, there can be bees still engaged inside of the structure. And so you'd have to clear them, otherwise you'll end up crushing the bees in the process of turning it. So they were just pointing out that there's some things to do still to maintain that structure. But all of the engineering between these different types of hives, why one thing is better than another thing in a certain context, we're interested in that study. So thank you for sharing those images.
Oh, certainly. Well, the image the image of the yellow and the blue is the polystyrene. That's the type.
That's right. Yes. Oh, right. Now, I've just started using polyhives, and my thought is that they offer very good insulating properties, and even though you might think polystyrene is not a very natural product, it might be the closest mimic to them being in a tree trunk, which is of course where they would probably naturally be residing. So it'd be very interesting to see how they survive in polyhives as opposed to wooden hives, and I've got colonies in both.
Okay.
What I would add to this conversation as we're sort of dwelling on the hives, another aspiration for our project is to engage with the natural tree hives, and we're based in a park in Tottenham, North London, Chestnut Community Centre, and we have friends of the park. They're our friends, they're the friends of the park, and we'll be working together on developing these projects for the area. But it occurs to me that we can help develop ways to bring hives to trees, to certain trees. And I think there's probably a new kind of hive to be innovated that maybe combines the benefits of some of these structures, but allows the bees to be nearer to their context, where the priority is not the priority of harvesting the honey, but the priority of developing healthy colonies in a space where they can thrive. Yeah.
Yes.
We're interested in that. And I know there's a practice, there's some traditional cultures where you've shown some pictures where people are climbing structures to get to where the beehives are. But there are some modern practices where the beekeeper climbs trees to maintain their man-made bee structures in the tree or in higher places. Yeah.
Well, that also makes sense because it prevents or limits the chance of people coming along and sort of interfering with the beehives. If they're up a tree, it's they're not going to encounter them accidentally.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so I think you're moving on to the anatomy now, aren't you?
That's right. Yes. So really, this section on bee anatomy is just a very broad sort of overview, so that you sort of got the idea of what bits make up a bee. So in keeping with all insects, they have a head, a thorax or chest area, and an abdomen, and they have 6 legs. On the head, they have 2 antennae, and they have 5 eyes. They have 2 compound eyes, one on either side of their head, which you've probably been very familiar with, and they also have 3 very small eyes called ocelli, and these are particularly used in low light conditions. So these are the sort of light detecting eyes, and the compound eyes are used more for general vision. They have 4 wings. They have a forewing and a hind wing, and they're sort of zipped together. So it looks like they've got 1 large wing, but in fact they've got sort of 4 small wings. And they also, on their hind legs, they have a comb where they can collect the pollen that they gather from the flowers, and then sort of comb it in through the joint spaces in their legs to make pollen baskets, which you might be familiar with seeing on honeybees and indeed bumblebees flying around your garden.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I have, yeah.
Yeah.
I was going to just mention about the wings, and it looks like kind of compartments on the wings. Is there do they have I don't know, like we have veins running through our body?
Yes.
Is that kind of like veins?
Well, they actually are called veins, though they don't carry blood in the way that veins do for human beings. I think they're more of a sort of structural strengthener, really. If you look at my next slide, it's a photograph of a bee where they've flown so much, their wings have actually sort of become disengaged. They've sort of worn themselves out, and you can see that they've got the 4 wings where they've become unzipped.
Yeah. I think the only reason I mention that is because I know with the queen, we clip the wings.
Yes.
At the wings. So I often wondered if it pained or, how it affected her, but she still carried on.
This is a very interesting and sort of controversial question amongst beekeepers, because really clipping the wings for the queen is for the convenience of the beekeeper. And the idea is that if you clip the queen's wings and you haven't done your swarm control properly and the bees are going to swarm, the queen bee will fly out, and of course she can't fly because her wings are clipped. So she'll fall out of the hive, and the rest of the bees will sort of fly out and try and find her, and they can't find her because obviously they're expecting her to be flying around, not sort of on the ground. And they will, and she will just sort of be abandoned on the ground, and then the colony will raise a new queen, and it means you don't have to check your colonies every week. Now, I personally am going to go very much against the grain of most beekeepers in my beekeeping association. I do not clip the queen's wings. I would rather do the weekly check and make sure that I've got on top of any swarming, rather than clip the queen's wings, though I think I'm in a minority there. Though for organic standards purposes, I think it's the Demeter regulations, clipping the queen's wings is not permitted either. So,
on what grounds? On what grounds is that not permitted?
I think because if they're going to have organic certification, they want the bees to be kept as naturally as possible, and so they will say, well, you don't clip the queen's wings. I mean, to me, I know it sounds bizarre, but obviously, if you know, just suppose something terrible happens and there literally is a forest fire next to your hive of bees. If we're in a totally natural situation, and this is why they use smoke to pacify colonies of bees. When you use a bee smoker, what you're doing is you're sending them the idea that there might be a forest fire nearby, so they will automatically go and occupy themselves, filling up their honey stomachs with honey, because they're going to have to fly away and escape from the fire. And that occupies them while you go through your whatever manipulations you're going to do. And just thought that if there was some particular reason why the colony needed to abscond for some reason, if you clip the queen's wings, then that colony isn't going to survive. And also, if that particular queen is of a good temperament and produces hard-working bees, you've just lost that queen's genetics, and you're hoping that the new queen that colony of bees raises is going to be as good, and that may not be the case. So it's not something. I mean, I don't think it would be physically painful for the bee to have their wings clipped, but my personal preference is not to do it.
Well, in our training, our bees were clipped for us, and we were advised to check our colonies every week. So even though our queens are clipped, we weren't advised to not check them. I go in my hive every week, barring the winter.
That's what I do as well.
Every week. So I do that religiously anyway.
Yeah, well, that's I hesitate to say that, sort of use the word should, but that's certainly the best way to prevent swarming, because both you and I are keeping bees in an urban environment, and if you're releasing swarms of bees, then of course they can go in people's roofs, in people's chimneys, and it can be very expensive to have them removed. I've got some slides further on, which I think are going to be in part 2, where I discuss the inconvenience to other people with swarms of bees.
I mean, this is, as we've touched on it, and I think we will, as you can see, we are going to sort of summarise our first part of this introduction around the structures, the anatomy of bees. But regarding the swarming, I've invited an old colleague of mine, Barnaby Shaw. Do you know Barnaby? No,
I don't.
He's a beekeeper in South London, and when we were based in Brixton, we were based at another adventure playground in Brixton. He was involved in Kenning Park. He's got several practices of bees. He's got several beekeeping practices around London. And so I've invited him to speak specifically about swarming and swarm control, amongst other things. It's an important issue. There's many things to consider around that. But obviously it's good that you're going to touch on it in the introduction in the second part. Yeah, so let's flow. We've got a few more minutes of this part. Let's summarise our points around the anatomy and the next points you have to do with us.
Okay, well, the final slide in this little section is really a little bit about the bees' internal organs, because obviously insects don't breathe in the same way that human beings do. They don't have lungs. They have a rather more passive breathing system, and they breathe through little holes in their exoskeleton, and these holes are called spiracles. And as the bee moves around, oxygen is naturally, or air is naturally brought into their system, and there's an oxygen exchange, and carbon dioxide is then expelled. So there's also, bees do have a mouth, and they've got this incredibly long tongue for collecting the nectar. They have their brains. They are surprisingly small. I mean, I know they're insects, so they're not going to be very big, but I'm not completely sure we've necessarily found the sort of seat of bee intelligence. They do have some neurons. Their hearts are like ours in the thorax, in their chest, and they have something called a honey stomach. So when they collect up the nectar, it all goes in their honey stomach, and when they fly back to the hive with that nectar, they then regurgitate the nectar to other bees in the colony for processing into honey, or sometimes they will regurgitate it into a cell themselves, and that honey is then processed by evaporation and stored. And they're also, the females, so the queen and the worker bees, have a sting, which has evolved from their sort of reproductive apparatus. So it's only the female bees that sting. And I think the last slide that I've got here is just to mention that insect size is dependent on the amount of oxygen they have available to them, because they have this passive spiracle-based system for taking on board oxygen. They can't be very big. However, of course, you can see fossilized dragonflies from the Carboniferous period, which have got a 6-foot wingspan. And the reason why they were able to survive in that era was there was so much more oxygen in the atmosphere, even with the passive breathing system through the spiracles, rather than having lungs like we do. They were still able to survive, but the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere has decreased since then, and that's why insects are limited in their size. So you're never going to get any 6-foot wingspan dragonflies, I'm afraid.
Level being 9. More detail mastery. On our level being 9. Mastery program. More detail on level being 9. Mastery. Mastery program. Wow. Mastery program. Mastery program. Level being 9. Mastery.
I think that this whole area, it will be, as part of our project, something very interesting to explore regarding the physics of how that works. Definitely. And I think it's an interesting point you've made about the creature's development and its relationship to oxygen, the oxygenation of the species. And I think you have a final area around the immune system. Is that right? Immune cells?
Yes. I just very briefly. I mean, my background in science is actually in hematology, and very specifically in rare disorders of human blood coagulation. But I did spend quite a lot of years studying human blood, and I was looking at the blood cells which are involved in immunity in human beings. Now, bees don't have blood in the same way that humans have blood, because of course we have red blood cells to carry our oxygen, and as I've just mentioned, of course bees don't have that sort of oxygen carrying circulatory system, because they have the passive version, but they do have something called hemolymphs, and this is where their immune cells are located. And I've got some photographs of cells that you find in bee hemolymphs and some immune cells that you find in humans' blood, and just to sort of show that they are not dissimilar, bearing in mind that, you know, bees are insects and are completely different from human beings. Their immune cells and our immune cells are, you know, interestingly not too dissimilar. So I might just very briefly say what the immune cells in human beings are. The top one, which has got a blobby nucleus, that just sort of flows around like an amoeba and eats up bacteria. And the next one down, that it very often will go around and attack viruses. The one under that, which has got lots of dark granules in, that will be partly involved with fighting off parasites. And the one under that, which is a lymphocyte, will be involved in the immune system and the memory of the immune system, so it will know how to respond to pathogens that it's encountered before. And the final one at the bottom is called an eosinophil, and this one is very definitely used against parasites, and it also has a part to play in anaphylaxis, which comes in later when we're going to talk about bee stings. So I think we'll save bee stings for part 2.
Yes. Okay. That's fine. That's fine. There's a lot there. There's a lot more to go through. Your presentation is very comprehensive, and I think we've had a really great introduction. Thank you so much for spending the time to do that. And yeah, it's such an exciting project. I'm hoping. I mean, we haven't spent much time to really. I think we're speaking as enthusiasts, but I have this feeling that many people listening, they may not be as close to these insects as you and I would like. So we're going to bring in some storytelling into our Science Week program, lots of different things to really bring to life how important our relationship is to nature, and these creatures are a good gateway into that. So thank you both for your time to explore this, and it would be probably useful for you just to give a sense of what's coming, Beekeeper Katy. Could you do that? Just give us a very swift sense of what's coming up in part 2.
Right. Part 2 is going to be about the roles of the bees within the hive and how they get through all their day-to-day tasks, and how they communicate with each other, and also how they see, how they smell, and aspects of their existence, to do with sort of their whole sensory experience, and also a bit about what they use the nectar and pollen for, and what we use the honey that they collect and other products of the hive, and then on through their life cycle and the whole swarming issue. Yes, and stinging. That's all for part 2.
Okay, brilliant. And I should say, because I know by now people will be in awe of your charming flow and insight around this. As well as doing this introduction for us, you've kindly agreed to do some more in-depth presentations on a few specific areas. For example, the waggle dance that the bees do, a special dance movement that they do as part of their communication. We're going to have an in-depth conversation just on this thing alone. And in addition to that, the importance of the genome. We'll be introducing the honeybee's genome and interrelated science around this by reviewing some classic research papers, and the pheromones as well. You have some special insight for this, the chemical influences that give a sense of how bees communicate with their environment and with each other. So I'm looking forward to hearing more about that, sharing more about that with our audience. And anything you want to say about those things briefly before we close?
Only that I've thoroughly enjoyed investigating them all more closely, because we're sort of heading out of sort of into inverted commas ordinary beekeeping into areas which most beekeepers possibly might not venture. So I've thoroughly enjoyed the research into how the waggle dance was sort of decoded. Really has been extraordinarily interesting, And I've used your kind invitation to participate in British Science Week to buy lots of lovely books and read lots of things. And I'm thoroughly enjoying the process. And I just hope that I'm able to pass on what I've learned to your listeners.
Well, thank you. Just to, let me leave. I know we're pressed on the time, but let me leave everyone with a very, perhaps a curious vision of how we work at You Learn Naturally. So we have a dance practice called Dankira Tawagi, which is African warrior dance. And I was explaining to Professor Jean Kritzkai about how we are making a dance form. We have already a dance form that resembles the waggle dance. We just have this form that is movement like this. But because we combine hand signing and other communicative gestures into the dance and the storytelling that we do, it means that we can really represent that whole phenomena in a very powerful way in terms of a show and a drama that explains it, that expresses it and allows people to get inside of it. So I think you and I will be having much more conversations as you have gone so deep into it, so you can help inform our dancers about the real essence of the waggle dance. So I'm looking forward to waggle dancing in your company.
Well, I should be doing the same. I mean, it sounds absolutely fascinating because to me, lots of people seem so separated from the natural world, but to me that just makes no sense because we're all part of the natural world.
That's right.
I mean, we're full of sort of bacteria that if they weren't present, we probably wouldn't be able to live. We've got all sorts of funny little things like eyelash mites and this, that, and the other. We're an entire ecosystem as human beings before we even sort of step out of the front door, and we can't divorce ourselves from nature.
That's right. It's because some of these things, we give them names and the names have been demonized. So as soon as you say a certain thing like bacteria or mite, people have a demonized idea of what it is rather than a holistic sense of the full balance of the relationship. Anyway, we're going in again, so let's keep steady. Thank you both. Abenah, do you have any final thoughts on our reasoning so far? You are Queen. I know I said in the first one, some of our listeners will have heard the first podcast, and I did introduce you as Queen Bee Abenah. So you do have a special role in our project. So what do you have to say as a summary?
Summarising, it doesn't even feel like a summary because we haven't even finished in this, so it's still much more to go. I'm just thoroughly enjoying it, and getting certain questions asked that intrigue me, or I have a question, like why does this happen, or things that while I'm doing my beekeeping, I ponder over certain questions, and I think, I'm going to have to ask that question to someone one day. So in this particular forum that we're doing, interviewing that we're doing now, I can ask those questions and comfortably get a reasonable answer that will make me feel contented, so to speak, and move forward, or maybe question it a little bit more. So I'm looking forward to the next part, and thank you, Katy.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you both. And it is special to have you because you're being 2 years in gives you practical sense of it, but also a lot more questions. You have questions, sound questions.
Yeah.
It's a very good position that you have to share with the listeners. Thank you for that. You know that Beekeeper Connell from Uganda, he's looking forward to making his presentation. So there's quite a few speakers to come from all over the world, and it's so exciting. Okay, thank you both. You Learn Naturally Radio. This is it. This is how we're doing it, and let's keep it. Let's keep being. Let's keep being. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you again.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Level being 9. More detail mastery. On our level being 9. Mastery program. Level being 9. Mastery program. Wow. Mastery program. Level being 9. Mastery.